you mentioned before the volatility and the uncertainty, and add complexity and ambiguity. That's the VUCA, the VUCA world we're living in. I mean, if you look at, even you can compare that stock markets and so on, everything until the 2000s was fairly predictable. And then suddenly it got kind of difficult. Then you had September 11th, you had the big crash of 2008 and so on. You had COVID, now you have the Ukraine crisis and so on. This is causing immense complexity and uncertainty. And the key is to have people who have the mindset to deal with this.
Following is my conversation with Philip Auinger. Philip is a supply chain practitioner turned into this amazing supply chain coach. Super practical advice. We talk about a lot of very practical matters about talents, skills, traits, and what does it take for an individual to be successful at the supply chain craft, and for teams and how to think about organizing teams and functions. Hopefully, Philip and I, we will be chatting many more times on these topics, but here is my conversation, at least part one of my conversation with Philip. Enjoy. Philip, sir, how are you?
Hi, Amjad. Thanks for inviting me to this call. I'm really excited. I'm looking forward to this.
No, and me too. When I first discovered you through your LinkedIn posts and whatnot, I made a note that, hey, you really hit some important subjects and you have a very unique take on it. So maybe, Philip, a good place to start is tell about a little bit about your journey and your excitement and passion about supply chains.
Okay, sure. So if I think back to my own supply chain career, it started out what I think many people go through. Fresh out of university, you realize you don't know a lot about the real life in supply chain. That was in the first week I was planning fast-moving consumer goods, very stressful business. And I had a panic attack. I ran to the toilet, I splashed water on my face just to stop myself from crying. So I just remember how, just speaking about it, I get goosebumps. And I worked myself up so that afterwards, I was a supply planner then I did supply chain project management, some supply chain controlling. And then also for several years, I was head of demand planning. So then, yeah, that's just a typical kind of career that I think many people go through in supply chain. And then back in 2018, I left the corporate world, but I kept my interest and my passion for supply chain. And I decided, okay, well, I'm in my early 30s now. What do I want to do with my life? And I really felt like I want to develop, I want to support people in their growth. And that's when I decided I want to be a career coach. And my focus now, and this is getting clearer and clearer, is absolutely to say supply chainers in the early years of their career. That's the let's say, the difficult years when you still have many questions and it's hard to get answers. And at the same time, it's also these, like these forming years. So everything you learn then and all the soft skills and mindset that you acquire at that point define the rest of your career. And that's exactly why I say this is really the target group that I focus on. And it's so much fun to work with students who are so ambitious and who want to have a good start into their career and who then, who knows, later on can be CEOs.
Yeah, no, so true. My personal story also, Philip started, I was a software engineer and focused into what we now all call analytics or data science and different machine learning. And then I was lucky to work with companies that had complex supply chain problems and working with business colleagues, learning the nuances of it. I figured out early on in my career that it is a lot more than technology or software, that there are business models, workflows, business processes, game theory, how you build trust. And so no, I could not agree more with you. And also the fact that it is a developing field, and the supply chain as a career, it is still in its infancy, and a lot of opportunity to learn it, do it properly. So
Yeah, yeah. And just look at the last 1-2 years. Supply chain now turned into a mainstream subject. Up
it
until two
is.
years ago, if you said, I work in supply chain, you got blank faces like, what is that? And then you might say logistics, then that might ring a bell. But now it's mainstream. Now everybody knows, supply chain issues and global transportation of goods. And now suddenly it's become something that people are aware of. And I think that's very good for us supply chain professionals.
Yeah, no, so we'll, I think, uh, get right into some of the questions that we got from
Sure.
our audience, Philip, and they are mostly supply chain business or technology executives, whether, Philip, on the practitioner side of things or
Mm-hmm.
on the solution provider side of things. And I try to consolidate these questions in different themes and groups. So one question that comes up quite a bit is that, hey, uh, uh, we are trying to find and build and grow right kind of talent. And
Mm-hmm.
so these are people asking from both sides of that equation that what is the makeup of an ideal supply chain candidate, whether at a beginner level or
Mm-hmm.
at a mid level, and then what sort of things uh, you know people should be looking for,
Mm-hmm.
whether if I am a person who is developing those skills or I am an employer who is looking to add those colleagues. So this question on skills, soft
Mm-hmm.
skills, hard skills, functional technical skills, it comes up quite a bit. So I think that's
Mm-hmm.
a good place, Philip, to start, that in your practice or your
Mm-hmm.
experience, uh, what are the sort of things that you can share with us?
Okay, sure. It really depends on the level you're looking for and also the specific role you're looking for. But overall, I always feel it boils down to being able to deal with numbers. And equally important, if not more important, is being able to deal with people. And I think that this is the kind of thing, or that's the kind of questions that you should also be asking during a job interview to figure out, okay, for this specific role, these are the kinds of challenges that people will be dealing with. And if you look at numbers, that can be, I mean, day-to-day business for me was downloading 100,000 lines of data from SAP and analyzing that. If you can't do that, you won't get very far in project management and supply chain. And I think that you can check this very easily. And I actually had this case once that was interviewing, to be fair, was interviewing for an internship. But we had a very young candidate, and she put in her CV that she has advanced Excel skills. And I thought, okay, well, that's impressive, because me, fresh out of university, I wasn't an advanced user. So we decided to test that. So what we did was we had our laptop there and we had just a short extract of data. So that was maybe 100 lines and 10 columns, just to see, is she able to analyze this easily? And she started looking line by line. And we said, well, imagine this were 10,000 lines or 100,000 lines. You can't work line by line, can you? And it turned out she didn't know how to set a filter, how to do conditional formatting, how to insert a graph, how to do a pivot, and so on. And then it was obvious, okay, well, she's not really that good at data analytics. That's fine if you're not good at it. It's fine if you're honest about it, but lying on your CV about it, that's not okay. And this is where I felt, okay, that's already a sign of not having technical skills, but then hiding it. That doesn't go well, because from the very beginning, you kind of wonder, what else did she lie about? And the next point, and this of course gets more important as you progress in your career, are, I feel, behavioral questions. Mm-hmm. So here you can ask, okay, imagine this difficult situation A, what would you do in this case? And I mean, this could be, I don't know, if you have a very quiet employee and you're trying to figure out their perspective on what's happening in the office, or how do you deal with a choleric sales rep, for example. I mean, I've had my fair share of those. Or I don't know, if there's a major project and you have to deliver bad news, how do you do this? And that's with these behavioral questions. What if you were in this situation? How would you react? That's where you can pin down very nicely, is this a good candidate? And of course, then also do they fit to the company culture and so on. But if you really make sure that your questions cover both the technical data part and the interpersonal soft skill part, I think that gives you pretty good understanding of if that candidate is a good fit.
Philip, on the behavioral side of things, can you maybe give us an example of that, that a type of question or an example of question to kind of set the stage for a problem and look at how somebody is going to look at solving it. So maybe if you want to, just from your recent experience, pick up, one or two sample questions, and then we can use that to make this point further.
Okay. Now, I worked for a big company for a few years, and I was very heavily involved in their development center. So I kept having the opportunity to be a role player there, to be an observer and to give feedback. So I actually created some of these case studies, and they were based on real life situations. And that was fascinating to see how people react. And very typical supply chain situation, there's a shortage of goods, and then you have to fight between several countries and see who gets the allocation, who gets the stock. And it's fascinating then to see, in terms also of a group performance, how do they come up with a compromise? And how do they make sure that they fight for their own country, but at the same time also show that they're not too evil, let's say, to their clients from the other, or to their colleagues from the other countries. And what else we had? That was actually when I joined the company. So in an assessment center, there was just a few weeks ago, a real life case, there was a strike. And they said a strike in a warehouse. And they were saying, okay, how would you deal with this situation? And that also, for me, I mean, I was fairly youngster at the time. I had never experienced the strike, but I kind of gave my answer and said, okay, well, I believe that ending the strike is the main priority. And then based on that answer, then we got into discussion. And that's where you really realize then, what do people also think about? Because every decision, of course, also has different impacts. And that was a very, very interesting job interview. And I got the job afterwards. So I think that we came to a good agreement here. And that's exactly what I mean. It really has to be these real life cases and these behavioral questions where you can see if somebody fits into the team or not.
So then I think we'll move to this other sort of family of questions where people ask a lot, that in your experience, that in today's world, what is a good way for a company to organize its different supply chain functions, whether on the supply side or demand side, or interacting with commercial folks, whether who build account plans and sales plans, and then, financial folks, they need to have their plans and forecast. So what is your sort of high level suggestions on how, and it's a supply chain is a very matrixed function. It connects with big parts, not only within an organization, but outside an organization in terms of an extended digital enterprise. So what are some of the best ways to think about organizing?
Okay. Now, I think generally, if you have this sort of a question, you can already guess the answers. Or you have to have the key players, the stakeholders sitting together and defining, how do you slice and dice a team? How do you say, okay, do we focus more, as you mentioned, do we go more on DP has to be hand in hand with sales, or should DP be hand in hand with SP, for example, in production? So wherever you draw the line, it will have pros and cons. And I think that's something that you have to accept and you have to live with. And at the end of the day, it really depends on how can you find a solution that works best for that specific company and for the current challenges. I personally, looking at what happened in major companies over the last 2 years, I saw very strongly that things were regionalized. So you had one head of demand planning, for example, then a team scattered over a continent reporting to that one person. And before that, maybe it used to be many small countries. So you had small teams very closely knit who really were able to solve questions quickly, but they were all kind of responsible for everything and nothing. And then with this specialization, of course, it was possible to say, okay, you really have demand planning experts, But of course, they're not as local anymore because you can't have a demand planning expert, for example, in every country. So this is what I mean with the pros and cons, and depending on how you slice and dice it. I think whatever a company goes for, the key is then to communicate it. And at the time, I mean, I was heavily involved in the introduction of a demand planning organization. Before that, it was part of every supply planner. So they were supply chain planners who also did demand planning. And then it was cut apart. So supply planners stayed local, demand planners became regional. And that was a decision at the time, top down, basically. But we said, okay, if this is the decision, so be it. But let's not just simply write an email and say this is the new setup from now on. But I really said, okay, I want to do a roadshow. And I visited all sorts of countries. I went through Eastern Europe at the time. It was more in hotels than at home, to really give all of these team members the chance to get a presentation about it, be able to ask questions, to raise concerns. And it was so critical for me also to say, I take this seriously. I hear what you're saying. I'm taking notes, because especially during the beginning, you can still adapt to things. If people never get this chance or never feel like they're heard, then you can come up with a new organization, but don't be surprised if a year later there's chaos and nobody knows who's responsible for anything. So I think it's really, communication is key there. And if you want to avoid the confusion around it, then be sure to explain why you chose this concrete setup. And I also feel, stick to it then for a while. Don't rechange it, and don't rechange the rechange then 6 months later. So really try to stick to one setup and let the organization digest it and get used to new processes, and don't overrush it and try to come up with a new solution again a year later.
I think you are spot on, Philip, there, that once you make such a change, communication and change management is such an important part of it. And then you have to let it sit there in an organization to learn it, absorb it, internalize it. It takes time. Like,
yes,
for us as people, learning any new skill, adopting to a changing new habit, acclimatizing to a new environment takes time. And organizations at many levels are a lot more complex than one can argue than just one person. So this question, Philip, comes quite a bit that you started to allude toward, that, okay, we cannot, be central everywhere. We cannot be decentralized for all functions. And at the end of the day, it all points toward what our business goals and objectives are, and what types of problems that we are trying to solve. So you alluded to that, where you had supply planning more centralized, and you had demand planning more decentralized, because people who understand.
The opposite, but yes.
Yeah. Okay.
One was local, the other was central.
Okay. Yeah. So tell us a little bit more about how did that pan out? Meaning, what were the pros and cons and trade-offs, and as the organization learned to live, to kind of adopt it and make use of it, what were some of the challenges or lessons learned in that exercise?
Okay. Now, the key was, at the time, and I was very lucky because it was such a major project. So I was allowed to pick the best candidates for the roles. So I could really say, okay, I want people who have very, very good social skills as well, not only analytical skills. So I was able to pick a team of people who were very good at connecting with people outside of their own department. And that's, of course, supply planning, customer service, sales, production. There are so many aspects and so many functions that are touched, of course, by demand planning. And that was critical for me. These people need to be in good touch with sales reps specifically, because if you want to get a forecast, if you've ever tried to get a forecast from a sales rep, that's already very difficult. And if then you kind of hide behind emails that you never even talk to them, then you're going to realize it's even more difficult. So that was obvious for me also then to say, okay, let the team also visit sales rep, let them also be on the road, let them go to customers and understand what's happening with the project, with the products afterwards, how are they used, what are the tricky aspects that also sales have, just to make sure that these strong interpersonal relationships also come to play and really build and get stronger over the years. because that made it a lot easier than afterwards to just have a quick call and say, yeah, could you just tell me roughly how much will this customer need next month? And that sort of a phone call is 10 times more effective than the fifth reminder on, I'm still waiting for the forecast.
Yeah.
And I think that's really the key. If you hide in your own department and communicate only via system and via emails, that doesn't fly, no matter which department it is. It's really about being in touch with people, because supply chain is extremely human. No matter how much AI and how much systems we get in there, supply chain is driven and managed by humans. And I think that's something that many companies somehow forget or don't put enough weight on.
No, I think that is such a astute observation. Since you started touching upon this example of demand forecasting, so a lot of people, Philip, ask questions like, hey, how do I build a good demand forecast? Now, certainly demand forecast can mean many different things from a different context. There are long-term strategic forecasts, and that are generally not at a SKU level, that are more at a higher level of a product grouping or product hierarchy. Then there are, more short-term ones that are execution focused, and there you have to be a lot more accurate and have to have high fidelity. And as you said, demand forecasting, demand planning is both an art and science. And at the end of the day, it is a human-centered function first and foremost. So people are asking these questions that, hey, how do I go about setting up a demand planning function, and what kind of tools, technologies, processes, people we need for that? As you said, rightly said, it is not just a software thing. And I'll kind of say one other thing here as well. Most people do recognize that their ERP systems don't have demand planning, demand forecasting, or any supply chain planning capabilities. ERP systems are not supposed to do those types of things. They are, at some level, ERP systems are systems of record. They just track what is going on and enforce business rules and ensure workflows and steps, but they are not planning tools. So in that, and today it looks like that most people are using something like an Excel to still do their demand forecasting. And then there is this, regional, global side to it. Some people feel, Philip, that, hey, people who are closer to the demand, meaning as opposed to a headquarter ivory tower sitting somewhere trying to figure out demand on planet Earth, people who really understand whosoever their end customer is, or the organic origination of demand, that they need to be closer there. And that should be the people side of the equation, that it should be decentralized, and we should try to sense demand that way, as opposed to some headquarter function figuring out. So have at it. I know that I asked like 10,000 questions, but that is a big part of what the body of questions that people are trying to figure out, because they, Philip, get all kind of diverse input. The AI vendors or supposed AI vendors will tell people, oh, human angle no longer important. You don't need to do anything. Somehow we have discovered the silver bullet algorithm, and that algorithm would do everything. On one end of the equation, and on the other end of the equation would be consultants saying, let's do it all. It's all artsy. Let's do it all art style with a bunch of domain experts and whatnot. And companies don't have time or resources for that either. So hence a question. So what do we do? So over to you.
Okay, of course, I know the answers to all of these questions, and I'm just waiting to sell them. No, jokes apart, I'm a people guy, not a systems guy. So let me focus really on the people side of the many questions that you just asked, as far as I can remember them. First of all, I think you started with ERP system and saying, okay, are these systems that that are even capable of doing demand planning, supply planning, whatever? I'm not a systems expert and never had a big joy of saying, okay, I love these systems or whatever. But I always felt that whatever system you do choose, it really depends on then having people who can use them. And I remember when DP, and we used at the time Apo DP, so SAP, when that was rolled out, we had really an SAP expert who explained highly complex functions. And we were sitting there, I think we were 6, 7 people in the room who really understood demand planning, who really understood supply chain really through years and years of experience. We didn't understand it. And that's where we said, seriously, we're the smartest guys that the company had to offer to come up with these new solutions, and we don't understand how this tool works. Maybe the tool is just too sophisticated for us. And we ended up using standard functionalities, which made sense, which worked just fine. And very often it was trusting a system forecast and sometimes enriching it. So enriching, of course, for A products or for products where you knew, okay, there's a big change coming up, then of course there would be enrichment. But most of the time we would just say, trust the machine. And that's where I fully agree. Yeah, if machines can get rid of the monkey work from humans, be my guest. That sounds wonderful. I don't want to have people who are here to perform monkey work, because sooner or later they're very happy with it, but it'll be difficult to get great growth out of them. Or anyway, they want to do more demanding jobs and they'll get so bored of the monkey work very quickly. So that's why I see this as an excellent opportunity to use AI to get rid of the annoying tasks and to make sure that these brains and even the communication skills that we have are utilized for really the difficult cases. Let me think, what else did you ask? You asked about demand aggregation. So starting bottom up or going top down and disaggregating. We had a discussion about this, and I was going to say it was a long and big discussion. No, actually it wasn't. It was a very short discussion, because all of these demand planning experts agreed we have to build our demand plans based on the closest we can get to the customers. And that sales reps customer service. So we said this has to be bottom up. And then afterwards, of course, aggregated on a regional level. And then, of course, you also have the statistical models which go over it. Because otherwise, if you go on such a detailed level, as you mentioned before, on SKU level, you can't make any realistic forecast on that for 2 years. But if we're doing an S&OP forecasting exercise, I mean, we're basing decisions on, do we need a new production site, or what's our footprint for warehouses and so on. You can't do that just looking 1 month in advance. So obviously you need that for maybe 1, 2, 3 years. And that's where obviously models will predict what's going on, or what we expect to happen. What even the best models in the world, of course, can't predict are things, if you look at the political situation in Eastern Europe at the moment, no model in the world knew that would come. So that's where, of course, you need the human touch again to say, okay, we have to review this plan and have to redo the whole S&OP data here, because obviously both supply and demand are completely different than we thought it was 2 weeks ago. And this is again where I feel that you can't simply trust the system alone. You will always need humans who look at it, who double check it, who sense check it, who check with other sources of data, humans like sales reps, who would just not deliver that type of information into the system. So that's where a system also has its barriers, for example, or where it has its limitations.
I think you answered this question that it is better, if I were to sort of say it in my words, to do bottom up, because with bottom up, at least, and if that bottom up work is being performed by people who are closer to whatever that segment of the market is, hopefully you would get a lot of that input and what have you. But then, as you said, then you have to apply statistical modeling to it to figure out how to look for several years ahead and whatever the different time cycles are involved. Some industries have to look way further ahead, like fashion apparel, that sort of thing. But you made this very important point, Philip, that today we live in a world where uncertainty, volatility is on a rise, and the frequency of black swan events happening has gone up. It's no longer Nassim Taleb's every 10 years or that kind of a thing. We are living in a lot more uncertain, volatile world. So one thing is clear, that no matter what the plan is, the moment plan meets this uncertain reality, course correction is needed a lot more often. So how do we plan, knowing that some volatility, some uncertainty will come our way? We don't know exactly what, because nobody can exactly predict future. But we know it is going to happen. We just don't know what type or exactly what, but we can probably figure out, different types or sources. So how do companies train their muscle on course correction or responding, the response muscle, that, stuff happens. Sometimes you can predict it, sometimes it is difficult to predict. But how do we respond? Because plans are, you and I, we both agree, Philip, are just starting points of a conversation. So the conversation starts with version 1 of a plan, but then as the plan meets the enemy or plan meets the reality, whatever you want to call it, this responding and course correction is needed. And they're just getting people on the same page that, hey, we are playing different games. And one of the games is that we have to course correct our plans. And organizations that are global and have a lot of functions, and some centralized, some decentralized, it takes practice to say, okay, every day we wake up, we have to do some training for course correction. So I think maybe that is where you can share with us your thoughts on how to train that. If planning is one side of the equation, then responding is the other side of that equation. How do we train the response muscle of an organization?
You hire me. No, kidding.
No,
I'm glad to come and visit companies to talk about this. But I think what you've already taken from the conversation so far is I focus on the people. And here, you mentioned before the volatility and the uncertainty, and add complexity and ambiguity. That's the VUCA, the VUCA world we're living in. I mean, if you look at, even you can compare that stock markets and so on, everything until the 2000s was fairly predictable. And then suddenly it got kind of difficult. Then you had September 11th, you had the big crash of 2008 and so on. You had COVID, now you have the Ukraine crisis and so on. This is causing immense complexity and uncertainty. And the key is to have people who have the mindset to deal with this, to accept, okay, whatever we did last week or a year ago doesn't apply anymore. So don't whine and cry about what happened in the past, because that used to be better, but accept that you're heading into a new world and that the rules from last year don't apply anymore. And there's a wonderful speech by Bill Clinton in the Georgetown lectures where he said, don't waste a second of your time wishing you had something that you can't have. And people who would love to have everything how it used to be over the last 20 years, I'm sorry, but supply chain has always been about change and will always be about change. Having said that, I still think it's very important to say that the change that's coming from the outside forces us to have the mindset to deal with it. And at the same time, I feel that if we, on top of that, especially as major organizations, now constantly have this need to reinvent the organization and come up with a new solution every 3 months, it's shaking the boat more than necessary. And I'm for the approach to say, let's give concepts the time, I mentioned it before, to be digested by the organization, to let people figure out what's their new role about, what are the new solutions, or what are the new contexts they have, instead of then again coming up with something with a new concept, because it sounds sometimes that on a very high level in management, there's this impatience to say, okay, the market is disappearing, so we need this new program, and we came up with this, or a consultant told us to do something differently. Slow down. Let the organization bottom up come up with the solutions. And if something like a Ukraine crisis happens, don't annoy the people who are actively working on it operatively now with, we need daily updates. And please update the plan now for the next 2 years. Let them take care of the firefighting for now. Of course, you will need some kind of reporting, and you will need some kind of a reviewed demand plan sooner or later. But in these really difficult phases, don't put extra strain on the people who are really working overtime and working on weekends, trying to find solutions and to find answers. And I think that's then also the key from a management level, how to deal or how to treat your team in a time of big volatility. Let them work in peace. Don't annoy them now with additional concepts or additional tasks. I think that's the trick to deal with the pressure from the outside without adding unnecessary pressure from the inside.
Philip, in your opinion, what are your thoughts regarding visibility? What is it that an organization and its people, they need to be able to sense and perceive and see, and whatever other forms of perceptions are available in that context, using that as an analogy? So visibility is a big topic today, visibility, transparency. So your thoughts on what does visibility, if done right, what does it look like?
Okay. I have 2 points I'd like to say in terms of visibility. One, just based on the discussion I had yesterday with a logistics manager. He deals, he's responsible for regional logistics and has a team of 260, 270 people. And I was chatting with him and asked, well, how do you deal with talent visibility, for example? And he said, well, so far we're not doing that. And it's so easy to say, okay, you have your leadership team meeting at a high level. And every time you do that, maybe it's once a month, you invite one of the people in the hierarchies below, not the direct hierarchy below, but one step below that. And let them prepare some kind of a presentation. Let them join for half an hour. And for a few minutes, they speak about themselves, about their current role and so on. And then they describe whatever project they have or proposal that they have. Then there's a kind of discussion going on. And then afterwards you say, okay, thanks for joining. Person leaves. And then you have another 5 to 10 minutes to say, wow, okay, she really seems to be very clever, and we could maybe put her into a project next year, that sort of thing. So have this kind of talent visibility, because otherwise you're kind of flying blind. And these talents are getting older and older. And these talents might start getting bored with operative roles. So option A is you keep them on board and they grow and they get a leadership role and you're going to be happy to have them for the next years, or you ignore the talent and great job, you just gave them a wonderful training and they're going to use what they learned for another company. And if you have really bad luck, they're going to go to a competitor. So I think that's really the key then to keep these kind of people. And if you're not aware of the talents that you have, then you can't act this way. So that's the people visibility of things. The second aspect, which I'd like to speak about, is more in terms of sharing data that you have also with suppliers and with customers. And this requires a lot of trust, obviously. But I spoke with a guy a few weeks ago and he said, he constantly quotes this. He says, trust is the currency of the 21st century. And whenever we speak about this, I would say, yeah, cooperation also goes hand in hand as new currency. And I think that this is true. If you want to have supply chains that are resilient and that can make it through VUCA times, then you'd better be very open about sharing thoughts, sharing data, and yeah, being more willing to cooperate with people outside of your own company. Within, of course, obviously, I mean, if you don't cooperate within, you're in big trouble anyway. But if you open up also to suppliers and to customers, you will notice a big difference. And things like bullwhip effect might be a thing of the past, because whenever you speak about things like supply chain disruptions, containers from China and so on, everybody said, oh, there's going to be a bullwhip effect. Now, I learned that at university. That's more years ago than I'd like to admit, so 15 years ago. And people always see it coming, but we're never able to prevent it. So something's missing. And if you think of the beer game, typically it's about communicating, about sharing data, and not everybody adding 10% on top just to be on the safe side, because that then puts extra strain on the supply chain. So here, obviously, this is all about trust and about sharing data. And here, I might have mentioned it before, it's dealing with the people also in the other companies. If they don't trust you and you don't trust them, then you're not going to share any data. And you won't have this benefit of the cooperative approach.
Is Philip, you mentioned the beer game. So I had the opportunity to go to MIT for many different things. One of that was to do an MBA at MIT as well. And suddenly I learned about the beer game. But it was interesting that over the past, Philip, 20 years, I had the opportunity both in a classroom setting at MIT and then in bunch of executive education settings going back as early to late 90s and then mid 2000s and then even this past decade, and with a very diverse group of colleagues each time playing the beer game. And since we are conscious beings, everybody knew about the beer game and the challenges involved in it. And it's a game, but in a classroom setting, every time, Philip, that it was played, and this is now, I at least played it 5 times over a course of 22-year period, every single time at MIT, the same pattern emerged, meaning people ended up making same mistake over and over and over again. So I'm not talking about just playing it once. I'm playing it, 5 times over a 20-year period. Every time different setting, smart people from all over the world getting together at MIT for a few days, or whether it was an executive education thing, or in case of an MBA, a different setting. But what do you say to that? And it wasn't as if that they were introduced to the beer game for the first time. Beer game had existed since early 90s, or maybe even dating prior to that. So with all that consciousness and reflexiveness and self-awareness about beer game, and you still play it, and you still end up making the same mistake. So now it is interesting that in a real life setting, what does it mean from a planning perspective, trust perspective, communication, transparency? So what can we, Philip, in your opinion, sir, what can we learn from the beer game?
Well, first of all, kudos for your learning curve. If you had the same result 5 times.
It was also funny, Philip, that, yeah, exactly. That in the settings, people knew, okay, we know what beer game is and how it is played. And we are not going to make the same mistake this time. And yet you somehow get into that middle of it and magnitude can be debated, but from a pattern perspective, a slight perturbation, introduced by the facilitators of the game causes that, bullwhip effect where everybody is trying to predict what future is going to hold and trying to plan and saying, let's not overreact, but you still end up overreacting and you end up with all that unproductive inventory and not knowing what to do with that. And usually it is played, the way it is done at MIT is, imagine a big room and it has maybe 10, 12, 20 big tables. Each table has a team and each team is playing that game and other people on the other table right next, they are playing that game. So 20 games are being played simultaneously and same pattern emerges. So what do you say, Philip, to that now when we bring that to the real life challenge?
First, a small counter question. If you look at these 20 teams, were they purely supply chain people? Or did you also have, let's say, controllers, sales reps, and so on board?
Very diverse.
Very diverse.
All over from many different organizational functions, IT included. So very well representative group, lot of diversity in the team as well.
Because this is something that I then feel is very important, especially if it's a crisis like this, or if you're thinking about reorganizing your organization, your setup, is to have people from various backgrounds sitting there and as diverse as you can. So this is various functions, various age groups, people who just joined the company and who have a fresh perspective, for example. And this increases your chances of dealing well with the situation because you have more input, more compound knowledge, let's say, compared to having the same team of 5 people who've worked together for 15 years and think they know how everything works. I believe, I don't know the algorithm behind the MIT beer game, but I believe that at the end of the day, they always want people to kind of feel it, to open their eyes and realize, okay, we really need to communicate more. And maybe we were too generous and too egoistic. So there might also be a hidden agenda here to, to promote or to make sure that you get the learning out of it. I think what can help here, if we look at a real situation, this is something that I dealt with also in my times when it was more about supply chain project management, also looking more at supply planning perspective, is if you motivate people only on a local level, they will think in local optimums. And that can be fantastic for a huge nation like Austria, which is really a small country. It's like 1/10 of Germany. But if you have many of these small countries always working only on their local optimum, that might not lead to a regional optimum. And I feel I'm a big fan also of including everyone in the success of a company. So really also to give bonuses to very, very low levels, because they're the ones who are creating the value. And I feel that if incentives are a mix of regional or maybe even global targets and local targets, that's where you also motivate people to think more of a regional optimum. And just a typical example, every country I went to, whenever there was a project and I noticed, okay, here's slow movers, it was always, yeah, that was a sample stock. We had to order a full pallet. Then the customer only took 30 kilograms and now the rest is lying around and it's probably going to expire and we're going to scrap it. Every country said that about the same product. And that's why I said, well, let's centralize sample stock, because I understand there's a minimum production quantity. I mean, I'm not a chemist, but I understand if you mix things together, maybe you have to produce at least 1 pallet. Fair enough. But then don't force every country to order a full pallet, but instead accept that the central location right next to the plant has this centralized sample stock. And if then you take 30 kg out of 1 pallet, you still might end up scrapping something, but that's how you get new business. So what? It's a sample. If you don't sample, then you don't get new business. But at the end of the day, you reduced these single pallets in 10 other countries, and you only have 1 open pallet or 1 broken pallet there. So I think that this is the kind of thing where you can tickle or where you can motivate people also to think more in regional optimums and not only for themselves, because it's understandable. You're paid by the local company, but still you're part of a big company. And the big company has its profit and loss and its balance sheet and so on in that one headquarter. So that's the kind of level that you should also consider when you make decisions like this, I think.
Let's go back to this thing that we were talking about a few minutes ago, where we said that, hey, one thing that technology can do is to help automate anything that is obvious or any mechanistic task that is a chore or a time waster and takes away from real work. If we look at work as, in two steps, one is just getting ready to do the work, arranging all the data, the tool, the people, bringing everybody together, data people wise, to say, now let's analyze, let's reflect, let's make a decision. Just bringing an organization to that point of thinking, point of collaboration, action, decision takes so much time. So you were alluding to that, let's automate some of those things. Can you give, from your own personal experience, some examples of such tasks or steps or that are big time consumers? They have to be done, but if you try to do it with human minds and hands, it would not be very efficient use of those resources. So
exactly,
would love to hear some examples of that.
Sure. First, let me note that there's a major company that calls number analytics decision support. I love that. And this is also what you mentioned now, is that these people make sure that other people, managers, whoever, are able to take decisions based on facts.
Yeah.
And that's what they're being paid for. They're not being paid for, I don't know, getting rid of empty cells to be able to make a pivot look nice, that sort of thing. I mean, you have to do it or else it won't work. But yeah, it's not adding value as such. And if you're able to outsource the workload, this annoying, I called it before, monkey work, if you're able to outsource that to a machine, perfect. I mean, that's as good as it gets. And these are things like, have you ever had a conversation and people who know Excel fairly well, they would say, yeah, make a macro. And then most people will say, well, I don't know how to make a macro. I didn't know it either. But every function you learn in Excel is really not that difficult. Once you tried it and once you discovered what are the intricacies about it, you realize, oh, actually, this is easy to reuse. For example, a macro. And then this way, it does the work for you and you don't have to do it anymore. There are still some things that just don't work. And there, I feel, or I'm a big fan, if you know that every country, if you're responsible for several countries, if you know that every country is or needs to work with the same type of data, then you don't have to have 10 people who create the same report month by month. You can centralize that. And then depending also on how your manager sees that or how your decision also on personnel footprint is, the question is, does that report need to be created by somebody sitting in Western Europe with a very high salary? Or could this be done by somebody in Central Europe, Eastern Europe, Far East, wherever? So obviously here you can also realize, okay, it's still human work that needs to be done because it's still some slice and dice that you just can't export. You can't outsource that to a machine. But if it still needs to be done, you can at least decide to standardize it, to regionalize it and say, okay, one person creates this, and this one person might actually be located somewhere else where at least you don't have to pay full Western European salaries for 3 hours of work, but you can do it for a lower salary. Of course, this is a very political decision as well. Or do you want to keep your employees locally in, let's say, the headquarter, or could this also be outsourced to another space? The question is always, what do the people who used to do this report do with the free time that they want? So again, this is a more political, conceptual discussion and also pros and cons to this. So here I can't give a fixed answer that will be perfect for every company. I understand that people can get nervous about this sort of a discussion.
No, totally. And as you said, that many of these questions have change management, perspective in organizations culture, and it's not just these are not simple questions. These are they are very complex dimensions and what have you. Look, this has been, Philip, an exciting conversation. I'm looking forward to many such future chats as well. But maybe you can take a few minutes and tell our audience about that, if what sort of things you like to do, and if somebody wants to get hold of you, certainly we'll add all the links and stuff in the video. But what would be a good way for people to get hold of you, and what type of projects or initiatives excite you? So maybe we can take a few minutes and talk about that.
Sure, I appreciate the opportunity. Thank you. So from my side, for people who want to understand, okay, what's the kind of topics I speak about, obviously this kind of podcast made it obvious. For me, it's really all about the people, about soft skills, also about mindset, because I realized that so many people in supply chain might be geniuses at analyzing data, but then afterwards, maybe not good at presenting it, maybe not good at taking decisions, maybe not good at networking within the company. So that's why I realized, okay, this is something that I want to focus on in my coachings. So what I offer is more or less focused on B2C, so really on the people who themselves say they would like to have a coaching or a training. That's the ones that I can support. And this can be one-to-one coachings. So that, of course, is extremely individual, or it can also be pre-recorded trainings where I say, okay, if you want to get ready for your next career step, if you want to get ready for your first leadership role, then reach out to me. And there's also a pre-recorded course. So then, of course, this is also financially more interesting, because then you don't have to pay one-to-one for my time, but you can also do things on your own. And this year, I mentioned it before, my big focus is really supporting also students in this. There's a tricky thing about students, I remember myself, is that, well, it's kind of hard to afford things. Money is tight when you're studying. So that's why I also decided, okay, I want to build a course here that's completely self-paced and accompany that with group coachings rather, and make sure that people have a smoother start into their career. And that's the B2C side of things. B2B side of things is, again, very much focused on soft skills. And this is very much into, as I said before, so not only analyzing data, but then also presenting it, presentation skills. What do you do with your voice? What do you do with your body language and so on, to make sure that the people you're presenting to take the decision that you want them to take, or give you the input that you need. So this is where many people struggle, because that's typically what you don't learn at university. And I feel that this is very relevant for B2B, for managers who feel that their team is struggling kind of, let's say, to summarize a big project into a management summary. Then call Philip and let's make sure that your team understands how to do this, because afterwards you're going to have a team that's a lot better at communicating and that understands that supply chain is about a lot more than just numbers, but it's really at least as much about people as it is about numbers.
That is fantastic. Thank you, Philip, for being so gracious with your time and sharing your thoughts. So much appreciated.
Sure. Thank you so much, Amjad. I appreciate the opportunity, and also kudos for you to preparing your own podcast. I do it myself. I know it's a lot of work, and I'm sure that the people get a lot of value out of it. And just looking at the previous episodes, I mean, that's rare to see so much knowledge available here on YouTube. I mean, interviews go for an hour or so. That's amazing value that you're providing to your community here. So big thanks also to you for doing this, and also for including me. It's a big honor for me. Thanks, Amjad.